Love the wedding, invite me to the marriage. Will the road you're on get you to my place? Need directions? Some things are written in stone. Keep using my name in vain and I'll make rush hour longer. What part of thou shalt not don't you understand? And one that I think is probably appropriate for us today and many people across the United States. You think it's hot here? Those billboards spoke of God in two different ways. The first, probably four that I gave you there, spoke of God in a loving manner, a God who loves and cares for us. And the latter ones was a God who eventually will stand in judgment of each and every person. And as human nature is, we obviously prefer the God who's always loving and tender and kind rather than the God who will eventually judge everyone. In fact, there are individuals who say that the Bible really is a picture of two different gods. The God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament. And one is as different from the other as night is from day. They believe that the Old Testament God is a God of judgment and anger, and that the God of the New Testament is a God of love and honor and compassion. And because of that type of thinking, their belief is, or whatever, is that they could never love or honor a God who is like the one in the Old Testament, one who is only a judge. But I think the Bible is pretty clear on the fact that the God of the Old Testament is the same God in the New Testament. The only thing that's really changed is the relationship that God had and has with his people. Under the Old Testament, God's relationship was centered around the law of Moses, if you will. But in the New Testament, it centers around the grace of God. But if you remember, in fact, I think it's Christ's own words in the Gospel of Matthew, he says that he did not come to destroy the law, but he came to fulfill the law. Now, those of you that have been here on Wednesday night for the past few weeks will be able to put this in proper perspective, because we went through the Jewish feast and how they pertain to the Jewish people, but at the same time, the relationship, how they tie into Jesus Christ. We know that he was the perfect sacrifice on Passover. He became our unleavened bread, the bread that feeds the world, but yet he was without sin, and I won't go through all of them. But you can see the connection there, hopefully, of our Wednesday night crowd, of how he didn't destroy that law, but he came to end up fulfilling that law. So I want to look for a few moments this morning at the differences between these two gods. And you don't have to turn to these scriptures now, but first off, we see in Isaiah, in chapter 6 there, one verse, chapter 5, we see that this prophet Isaiah, he sees this God, and he reacts with fear and with trembling. He says, "Woe to me," I cried, "I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips. And if I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King Almighty." And I live among people of unclean lips. We go back and remember the story in Exodus. It tells of the time when God gave the Ten Commandments to his people. And after Moses received those commandments on Mount Sinai, he came back down to the camp. And the scripture says that when the people saw the thunderings and the lightnings and heard the trumpet and saw the mountain in smoke, that they trembled with fear. And they stayed at a distance and said to Moses, "You speak to us yourselves, and we will listen. But do not have God speak to us, because we will die." They feared this God. Later in Israel's history, which we're going to read part of those scriptures now too, but further along later, the prophet Elijah met God on that same mountain that Moses met God there to receive the commandments. Called by two different names, Sinai or Horeb, but it's the same mountain. The Lord said, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountain apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. And when Elijah heard it, the word tells us that he pulled up his cloak over his face and hid and stood at the mouth of the cave. So when you consider what God is like, I've just given you two different ideas or images of Him. These are, even though they're different, they're the very images that we must understand and that we must comprehend if we are going to be changed into someone that can make and will make a difference in our church and in our community. No, I'm not going there again, Pete, but I'm close. But we have to understand, because we're going to run up with people, if we ever witness to anybody, you're going to run up with people that say, well, I can't obey a God of judgment. I didn't think God was like that. I just think that there's just a God of love. You have to know that there's two sides of God. He is a loving God, but there comes a point in time when He has to judge. And we need to understand those differences if we ever expect to make a difference in someone's life. Most of us here today have grown up in the church, and we've always been exposed to these stories, whether it's the ones I've read today or others, and it gives me an opportunity to plug Sunday school. Again, that's when we learned those stories, was in our Sunday school times. You don't hear preachers preach on those stories that we learned when we were in Sunday school. Not very often. We don't talk about Moses and bulrushes. We don't read or talk about David and Goliath, and we could go on and on and on. So most of us have been brought up in Sunday school and church, and we've heard those stories all of our lives. So we are not troubled by those stories or the differences between a God that's presented in Isaiah and Exodus versus the one that's presented in Elijah. There are people who are troubled by the God that's presented by Isaiah. And I think that's because the idea of being in the presence of an awesome and a fearsome God is frightening to somebody, because the reality hits home and they realize that God is holy and that they are not. And if we stop and think about that this morning, there's a great, big, vast difference between a God who is holy and we who are not. That's what Isaiah is reflecting here in his comment. He says, I am ruined, he said, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among people of unclean lips. Isaiah found himself in the presence of a holy and a righteous God, and he was forced to acknowledge his uncleanliness. I believe that that's why when we get ourselves in a mode of worship, when we can truly give ourselves to God and allow Him to minister to us, as in times like we had this morning, I think that's why it becomes so emotional to us, is because we realize that we are not in charge, and that God is, and that He is holy, and that we are not, and we see our insignificance. And when we see how insignificant we are compared to God and according to God's plan, compared to God's plan, then we are very small. Very small. When Isaiah experienced God's presence, he humbled himself and he acknowledged God's right and authority in his life. But there are those who come face to face with God's righteousness and holiness, and they reject it, even though they come face to face with it. They're offended by being faced with a God who's bigger than they are. And I think one way that they react and why they're offended is because they're no longer the ones that's in charge of their lives. We've all seen them. We know who they are. There's some people that cannot give up being in control. We call them control. I call them control freaks. I don't know what you call them. But if I can't do what I want to do, and if I can't get you to do what I want to do, something's wrong here. I've got to control everything. And that's the problem for people, to give themselves over to a God who makes Himself in charge of our lives rather than them being in charge. words, if God is bigger and more powerful than they are, then He, not they, have the authority to set the rules. And we've talked about this before when it comes to change. That's why we balk against change. Because God expects us to do something different than what we've done before, and we don't like to do anything different. We like to keep on doing the same old, same old. And what's the definition of insanity? Continually doing the same thing over and over, expecting different results. So if this isn't working in our life, or if this isn't working in our witnessing, or if this isn't working in a financial situation, and you pick whatever, if it's not working, and yet you're doing the same thing, how can you expect it to be different? Is that camera moving, or is it? It's got me. I just realized you headed back there and I'm moving all over the place. I'm sorry. But God is bigger than we are. That means He's in control and we are not. And that causes us sometimes to recognize that we are not as big as we think we are. And that hurts sometimes. When we recognize that we're not as quite high up on that pedestal as we once thought that we were. When the Israelites gathered at the foot of Mount Sinai to receive those 10 Commandments, I think God deliberately and decisively let them know that He was in charge. In other words, He drove home the point in no uncertain terms that He was bigger than they were. First off, we're told in the 19th chapter of Exodus, verses 10 through 12, He said, "The Lord said to Moses, go to the people, consecrate them today and tomorrow, have them wash their clothes and be ready by the third day, because on that day the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all people. Put limits for the people around the mountain and tell them, be careful that you do not go up on the mountain or touch the foot of it, for whoever touches the mountain shall be surely put to death." Then they're told, verses 16 through 19, on the morning of the third day there was thunder and lightning, with a thick cloud over the mountains and very loud trumpet blasts. Everyone in the camp trembled. Then Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was covered with smoke because the Lord descended on it with fire. The smoke billowed up from it like a smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently, and the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder. Then Moses spoke, and the voice of God answered him. There's an awesome display of the power of God there in those verses and that story that He's presented to us. But God didn't always speak to Moses that way. He didn't speak to David that way always. He didn't speak to Abraham always that way. And for any other number of people in the Old Testament that we read about. But on this particular occasion, God deliberately orchestrated a sound and a light display to establish that He was in charge. He was saying to those people that He had the right to say what the rules were because He was bigger than they were. He had the authority to say what was right. He had the authority to say what was wrong. And in that mountaintop experience, God was saying, I am God and you are not. I'm bigger than you are. I make the rules. I tell you that you're a sinner. I tell you that you've fallen short of the glory of God. I'm in charge. We don't like to hear that. There are a lot of people in the world that don't like to hear that God's in charge. They feel threatened by God's sovereignty, of His right to stand in judgment over them. They feel that they need to assert their righteousness, to let God and everybody else know that they're in charge. And one of the ways that they let people know that they're in charge, that God has no control over their lives, is that they try to become God. And the way they try to become God is they pass judgment on everybody else. They're not doing it. They're supposed to do it. Well, if I was living like that, I'd be down on my face, on my knees before God. I mean, we can go on and on and on. It's an effort to say, I know what's right, I know what's wrong, I set the rules, and they need to be doing thus and so. If any of us were to stand up this morning, we could all find fault in one another. We're none perfect.